Hey there, Pastor Anthony here with another episode of Sermon Snacks. Today the focus is on Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verses 1 through 15. Our thematic word is time, the one word kind of encapsulating the meaning of the text. I'm doing this for each of the sermons, reducing it down to one word. Here it is, time in this section. In this passage of Scripture, which is very familiar to us because of the band The Byrds, turn, turn, turn. This is that great poetic section in chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes. And what we see here is the author moving out of prose into poetry. As we recall in our last episode, I talked a bit about the arguments that that big section from 112 to 226 in the text is an autobiographical memoir, maybe a funeral, grave site memoir of a person looking back on life, giving wisdom and evaluation of that life. There's some disagreement among scholars about that genre analysis, that there's perhaps we shouldn't categorize it exactly like that, but it's certainly autobiographical prose at the very least. Here we come into a very different section, a very different genre. We definitely are dealing with poetry, beautiful poetry, in fact, and that's why it's resonated. This is a text that's in the Revised Common Lectionary. It's read on New Year's Eve. It's part of just a sense of time and thinking about life that way and our relationship to time. So just wanted to bring up a few of the interpretive challenges in this text, kind of go back behind the scenes here, a little bit into the kitchen with the ingredients, thinking about how the sermon gets made, right? And one of them is this whole issue of how to interpret this text. Now, most of you will know that there, with regard to the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon, there was a big debate. Is this an allegory? Should we take it literally? How should we interpret this book? And throughout church history, there has been a couple of different camps on that interpretation of Song of Songs. And of course, there is also one that can see a both-and approach. Well, when it comes to this poem, there's been a similar kind of battle over how to interpret it. Should we interpret it literally or figuratively? Should it be interpreted allegorically? How are we to interpret this? For example, there is one scholar who argues the whole thing is about the nature of the church, God's governance of the church, and there's a time to be born would be the idea of that the church has a time of growth, and there's a time to die. The church has a time to be chastised. So that he allegorized it, this Old Testament scholar, to God's governance and rule over the church. Now, I don't think that's warranted at all, but that's some of the allegorical stuff that's been out there. Now, there's perhaps the most controversial, to give you one example of the interpretive challenges around this, is the issue of stones. What are we talking about with stones? And that's in verse 5, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together. What does that mean? What's the reference? Well, there is a whole strain of allegorical interpretation around this, which comes out of some of the Jewish commentaries on this passage that link this to sexual intercourse, if you can believe that. And the basic idea is that there's a time to engage in that activity and time not to, and it was based on the menstrual cycle. And so, if you will, on the PG version of this, I guess, that during the time what would be considered uncleanness under the law, you should gather stones and store them up for the opportunity to, when you get out of that zone of uncleanness, to then go ahead and throw away your stones, so to speak. So, does that have any basis? I don't think so. But it gives you an example of what some of the allegorical ways of interpreting this. Now, why would I say that I don't agree with that? Because I don't think Scripture really upholds that view. There's a variety of ways to think about that. I mean, one way is a very simple idea of military warfare. A time to throw away stones, obviously in combat, and a time to gather stones together to prepare for war, to engage in war. There's also passages in the Scripture that talk about, as a way of kind of destroying your enemy's fields. You could throw stones in them and make it difficult to do that. And also when you want to do agricultural work, you have to remove stones from the field to be able to plant. So this may be a reference to warfare. It may be a reference to spoiling an enemy's field. It may simply be a reference to harvest and planting and knowing when to do those things. Let me give you a few examples from Scripture. For example, here comes out of 2 Kings 3:19. You shall conquer every fortified city and every choice city, every good tree you shall fell. So you got this kind of idea. All springs of water you shall stop up, and every good piece of land you shall ruin with stones. And so this is how you could destroy your enemy's field, throw a bunch of stones in them. In the same chapter, verse 25, the cities they overturned, and on every good piece of land everyone threw a stone until it was covered. Every spring of water was stopped up, so they basically enacted this, right? So everybody had a stone, they threw it. This was a way of destroying the land here of the Moabites. So that's one possible interpretation. Another place, Isaiah chapter 5, verse 2, it says, he dug it, this is a field, a hill, fertile hill, and cleared it of stones, and planted it with choice vines. So you see the imagery there being agricultural imagery. So I'm thinking that those are a more accurate way of dealing with that particular issue. But that's a big issue. I've got some pages there cited from Gradanis and Belcher where they deal with this very topic. So I'm in favor of a non-allegorical interpretation, giving place for metaphor and figurative language, but overall, I think we should take it in those ways. But that's one of the big issues that comes up in the interpretation of this text. Secondly is the overall interpretation of the poem. Is this about good timing or God's timing? And this is a good question. So some people, and Belcher, Richard Belcher, who I've talked about, kind of takes this position, is that really what we have here is this poem is about having good timing in life, like us, knowing when to speak, when not to speak, knowing when to store up things and to not store up things, knowing those type of wisdom issues. That's primarily about human behavior, human wisdom, something very akin to Proverbs. Now, in my sermon, I did give in my application some level of credence to this interpretation. I do think it's there on a certain level. But I guess I would put it in a subsidiary role. You can kind of tell by how I preach the sermon that it's subordinate, I guess, to what is God's timing. I think the overwhelming major point of the text is that God is the Lord of time, and I brought that up significantly. That goes to that idea, at verse 14, I know that whatever God does endures forever, nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done this so that all should stand in awe before him. The point is, this is about God's timing. He controls everything. He sets things in their times and places, and we are somewhat we're along for the ride. I use that analogy of the train in my sermon based on Eric Weiner's book, Socrates Express. But so there's these two ideas, and then I have this opportunity here for a both and option, and that's kind of what I did, although I placed the idea this is mostly about God's timing and not about having good timing in our lives, although that's important, and the scriptures do address that, and I think it is something that you could draw from the text as a piece of application, which I did, of course, in my sermon. So that's one of the major interpretations. Should we do it allegorically? Should it be literally? Obviously, I went more for the literal. The other interpretation is it about our human good timing, or is it about God's timing? I kind of went for a both and, but my emphasis was here on God's timing, which I think is right, of course, or I wouldn't have done it. Okay, so let's look at the next one. Can you repeat the question? What am I talking about there? Well, in chapter 3, verse 9, and I didn't really deal with this at all in the sermon, there's a repetition of a question that we heard earlier in the book of Ecclesiastes. If you remember, in the very opening section, chapter 1, verse 3, what do people gain from all the toil at which they toil under the sun? Then, after the poem, in chapter 3, verse 9, our text here, what gain have the workers from their toil? Now, there's a commonality there, right? There's the question about gain and profit, and there's the question about toil. And so why is he coming back to this question that he answered earlier, right? He answered this question, well, there's basically no gain, right? It's futility. It's all futility. You can't take it with you, right? There's nothing. It's unprofitable. It's repetitive. Life is, meaningless. And you really can't have a profit from your work under the sun unless you reach out and have your life about something more. Well, he answered the question, but now he seems to come back to it here. What gain have the workers from their toil? What gives? Why is he coming back to this question? Well, there are commonalities there, which are this gain and toil, right? These two words that are used frequently. But if you notice, there was one word that changed there. If you go back to chapter 1, verse 3, what do people gain? And here we have, what gain have the workers? And so originally, that word people is the word for humanity. It's in chapter 1, verse 3. That is, Adam, right? This is the, so it's this term about working and toil. Here we have a different word. We have the word for workers. And Belcher actually argues, Richard Belcher in his comment, that this second term, this latter term, workers, is more broad. It's a broader term for human activity. And so what the argument basically is why is he repeating the question, is we might look at chapter 1, verse 3, more of a narrow idea of labor and work in the sense of what we would think of as paid labor, right? Things you get paid for. Where this is here in chapter 3, perhaps a more broad vision of all of human activities. And so what he is doing here is, there was a more narrow focus, this is a broader focus, and so he's expanding that examination to all of human activities, relationships, warfare, all these type of things, and our whole totality of life, which is borne out by the structure of the poem that I talked about. There is a time to be born and a time to die. This is the Alpha and Omega. This is the whole totality of human experience, and what he's doing is coming back to, it's not just your work that's futile, it's almost all of human activity that's futile. Why? Why does he come to that conclusion here? Because he's looking at the idea of time, and he's saying, look, we can't control it. We don't understand it. How can we act wisely if we don't know the future, if we can't tell or really gauge or estimate or predict what's going to happen? Our decisions are ultimately futile and foolish because we don't control time or seasons. This is what Richard Belcher writes in his commentary. Quote, "There is no profit from human activity because people cannot understand what God is doing in the world. And so they are unable to make the appropriate decisions at the proper times. Thus, the best response is to enjoy life," which is not a positive conclusion, but like 2:24, as we looked at in the last sermon there on meaning, is the best that someone can do in light of the frustration of not being able to understand what God is doing in the world. So it's a very similar type of conclusion in a way, that efforts to make wise decisions about times and seasons is difficult because we don't control time. So there's a humbleness in this, a humbling of people. Now, if you tried to predict the weather, if you tried to predict the stock market, if you tried to predict human behavior, did anybody predict 2020? No, right? So there is something to this, right? It's really, we lack this capacity, and that can make a lot of what we do seem futile planning, right? And that's kind of what he's getting at, the broad spectrum of human activity. So what is our option? It is to go and stand in awe of God, to worship Him, and to, under His authority and under His wisdom, to trust in Him and to try to make wise decisions the best we can in this world, but always knowing that we can't control this, right? We're not the engineer on the train. We are along for the ride. So that's where he repeats this question. It's a broader scope about human activity, not just labor or profit. Okay, and then finally, I just want to say a word about eternity in our hearts. Eternity in our hearts, chapter 3, verse 11. He has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, He has put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I love that verse. That verse just sticks with me. This is He, of course, God, has made everything suitable for its time. God's the Lord of time. Moreover, he has put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. And I just love that mixture of the fact of a sense of eternity in our hearts, a sense of history in our hearts, that God has created us that way. He's put that into us. And it makes me think of Alvin Plantinga, and one of his original books was about God and other minds, about a sense of about the past, and we believe in a past. It's a basic belief, but you could argue about, can we prove there's a past? Can we prove that other people have minds? That there are other minds, and he's talking about that in the sense of apologetics and about rationality of belief in God. We accept these certain things. And also he talks about the sensus divinitatis, the sense of God that God put into our hearts. And so I was thinking about Alvin Plantinga's philosophy around all of that sentence there. He has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, he's put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. So we have this thing in us, but it's kind of frustrating because we still can't figure it out, right? We understand the past. We talk about history, studying history so as not to repeat history, and yet don't we see the repetition? And then there's this kind of yearning sense of a future, and we try to predict that future. And there's algorithms. There's people on Wall Street, PhDs in mathematics, trying to run quant programs to figure out, but we can't do it. There's a frustration around it because only God is the Lord of time. But we have this ache within us, this sense of a broader experience that we don't live just in the moment. There is a past and there is a future. And I just think that's a profound statement, and it ultimately ends up that we can't figure it out. What is our choice? Our choice is to worship and trust God, to learn to walk on the train, as I say, to make the best decisions we can. And I think you can make better decisions if you have a humility about your ability to predict what's going to happen. So I think that's part of wisdom. And that same humility also leads you to trust the engineer of the train, to trust in God, knowing that you're on for the ride. You can try to learn to walk well on that train, but ultimately it is not in your control. Now, the thing we find comfort is that God is the engineer. God is in control, and even though sometimes we can't totally figure out what's going on, we trust that He's going to the destination that is for our good, for our blessing. And what I tried to emphasize in the sermon is one of the reasons we can have that conviction is because of the sending of Jesus Christ. At just the right time, at the fullness of time, God sent His Son. There's a plan, right? There's a plan that God is executing, and He's executing it perfectly well. And so we can have this sense of trust that He will complete that plan, that the train will get to the destination, even though sometimes in our minds it's a pretty bumpy ride. It will get there in the end. That's our hope. That's our trust. And that's a sermon snack for today on Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 15 on time. Thanks for tuning in. God bless.